Okay, Chris,
Yes.
start off by telling us when and how you first knew you were going to be an historian.
I think it was in my last year as an undergraduate. I was not the
What
most I was not the most distinguished of undergraduates.
what were
Um,
you studying?
Medieval history.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I studied it at St Andrews University. I spent my first 3 years at St Andrews University doing not very much in the way of medieval history. And in my fourth year, I realized I had finals coming at the end. And so I started working. And the funny thing, because it's quite lucky we have 4-year degrees at St Andrews, 4-year undergraduate degrees. And once I actually started working and revising, I thought, well, this sounds really rather interesting. So I started actually getting interested in history.
So it
But
was
if you'd told me when I was 15 or 16 years old that I was going to be a medieval historian, I think I would have committed suicide. I mean, the only thing I really wanted to do at that age was play cricket for England. Um, as you will know, that never happened. Anyway, that's when I decided I wanted to be a historian. So I did a PhD, and then that everything followed from that, which was
so
lucky.
so focusing on the medieval period was just a matter of chance, just what you happened to be studying, or did you make a decision
No,
about that?
no, it was a decision. Because at St Andrews, what you do is you study different subjects. You study several subjects for your first couple of years, and then you have to choose at the end of that which one you want to do for honours. And the medieval history department, well, it has for long been, I think I'm right in saying, the biggest medieval history department in the country. And it was and still is a very good teaching department. And they sucked you in, and
Yeah.
they were always helpful. They were always friendly. They were good, and that's what I wanted to do. But then, as I say, when I started really working at it, I just found medieval history really fascinating.
So, and that's what you've always done. Yes, I know you've studied and written about this period in particular,
Yeah,
for the end of the 14th and the beginning of the 15th centuries, a lot. So, I'm assuming I'm right in saying that you've always been aware of Thomas Arundel's part in the story. So,
yeah,
tell us
yeah.
how
I
you
mean,
came to the realization that you needed to tell his particular story.
yeah, yeah. Well, you may or may not know that about 10 years ago, also with Yale, I published their Henry IV, which is they have a series called Yale English Monarchs, and they publish what they reckon to be quite big books um, on each of the English monarchs. And the medieval ones are now complete. It's a great series. Um, but the more I tremendously enjoyed writing about Henry IV. But the more I wrote about Henry IV, the more I realized that Thomas Arundel was a man who really needed his own story telling. So when I finished Henry IV, for a couple of years I did other stuff because I was a bit reluctant, because I thought a lot of people would probably think this is really Henry IV Part 2, and shouldn't Given Wilson be doing something else. Um, but in the end, I was just drawn back to Thomas Arundel because, I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I do think he's an absolutely fascinating man, and he is so involved in everything that happens.
So
Uh,
was his absence from the Shakespeare plays anything to do with wanting to write his story?
well, not directly, but I mean, I think it's quite significant. Um, I mean, Shakespeare, you've obviously had a look at what I said towards the end of the book about how Shakespeare completely ignores him, which is fine. I mean, Shakespeare had very obvious, good dramaturgical reasons for doing that, because he was intent on showing Henry IV as a man of action, a man who made his own history and got himself to the throne. Of course, by the time we get on to the Henry IV Part 1 and 2, he's a very different sort of character, but that's all part of Shakespeare's dramatic imagination. So it's not surprising that he wrote Thomas Arundel out of his histories, although he didn't do it deliberately; he just ignored him. It's not surprising because Thomas Arundel was so instrumental in bringing him to the throne that it just didn't fit with
Yeah.
Shakespeare's view of Henry IV.
Well, Shakespeare was, I mean, I shouldn't be talking about this. Carol can talk about this much better than I can. But Shakespeare's interpretation of history is a bit dodgy in other places. I mean, Richard III and Macbeth, they stray quite a long way from the historical facts of things. So, but
yeah. I mean, I thought that it was a point. The context in which I made that point in the book was that Arundel is really remembered as nowadays as a churchman. And if Shakespeare had included him, he would have had to write him up as a churchman, really. But Shakespeare, I mean, Arundel without Henry IV's reign is very much seen as a politician. And that's why Shakespeare didn't really want him in the play, because he was too much of a politician.
Right,
He was innately political, Arundel.
yeah.
Got himself involved in all sorts of things. But anyway, I'm not trying to criticize Shakespeare. And
No.
yes,
So,
we all know that he's obviously a brilliant dramatist. And we all know that his history can be a bit dodgy, but that's absolutely fine with me. He was writing drama, not history. I'm not trying to take him down for that.
I mean, he was not doing historical research as we know it today. I mean, he was basing himself on Holinshed
He was
sources
Holinshed.
like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
He was. Yeah.
So, to pick up on that particular history thread, you mentioned at the very beginning of the book that respondents to a BBC poll,
Yes.
which I think was organised by BBC History magazine, is that right? They voted Thomas Arundel as the greatest villain of the 15th century, a time which also included Richard III. So, why did he rate so highly as a villain?
Yes, well, I mean, that I have to say that was also a little bit of a spur to write his biography, because I thought frankly this is just so unfair. I mean Arundel has in some quarters gone down as a historical villain, but above all that is because he is the man who there was a reason given in the answer to that poll, which was because he persecuted the Lollards, and the Lollards were in favor of various things like vernacular masses and a lay priesthood and so forth, which a lot of people now agree with. So it's a bit of a 20th or 21st century judgment on Arundel.
So hindsight comes into play on this, on the part of the people voting.
Well,
because the Lollards' view is a much more, I don't know, reformed, modern view, and there's more sympathy with the Lollards than there would have been.
And in many ways, it's quite a Protestant. I mean,
yes,
the Lollards were pretty close to, the Lutherans and Calvinists and John Knox followers and so forth in the 16th century. They had a lot of the same ideas about things like transubstantiation and image worship and so forth. So that is something. And I mean, we live in a Protestant country, don't we? An Anglican country, not a Catholic country, most definitely. And so it's not surprising that has a certain amount of appeal to people.
Yes, so Arundel was clearly a survivor in what was a notably dangerous time to be involved in these things. And his oldest brother and Archbishop Scrope all came to bad ends after all. So how did he manage to survive? How did he manage not to make enough mistakes to have the worst end come to him?
Well, I mean, I could give you a brief answer to that. In the Parliament of 1397, he was convicted of treason. And normally, of course, that would have meant a rather unpleasant death, although aristocrats like him were given a quicker death, usually just by execution, by beheading. But clerics were not. They were not generally executed. I mean, the appellants in 1388 had not executed Archbishop Neville, even though he was accused of treason as well. On the other hand, this is a dangerous time for archbishops. I mean, during Arundel's lifetime, 4 archbishops, 2 of York and 2 of England, were convicted of treason. Oh, sorry, well, no, Sudbury wasn't. He was lynched by the mob in 1381. Um, so yeah.
Today that would be the press doing that, of course.
Well, it might be. We probably better not go there.
No. I was thinking about Scroop in particular, but yes,
Yeah.
there are others as well.
Yeah. But I mean, there were certainly plenty of people in the early part of Henry IV's reign, when the crown really did lie very uneasy on the usurper's head. There were certainly people who, had they won a military victory over Henry IV and captured him, would, I'm quite sure, have executed Arundel as well as IV. Because he was seen as the Kingmaker, the man who had in effect, smoothed Henry IV. I mean, in some ways, constructed Henry IV's path to the throne. So I don't think he would have survived that. But so fortunately, Henry IV, for all his faults, there was one thing he was very good at, and that was fighting. He was an extremely good soldier, and he never lost a battle. And so he survived, and if he survived, Arundel was going to survive.
Yeah. So this being a period which you've written about and studied considerably before, were there any surprises in the course of writing this story? Did anything come to you that you hadn't expected to come upon?
Well, it was interesting looking at his contribution as Chancellor. I mean, Arundel. I think it's not generally recognised that the idea of having one man as both head of the church in England, and as head of state in England, which meant Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor, because the Chancellor was the head of the royal administration, was something which was very unusual in the Middle Ages. The only person who had held it for any significant length of time before that was Hubert Walter at the beginning of the 13th century. But we think, because of all the great Tudor Chancellor archbishops, people like John Morton and William Warham and so forth, because of that, we kind of think it's normal for a head of church also to be head of the royal administration. It's most unusual. And Arundel is, in a sense, the precursor of those great Tudor archbishop chancellors. So that, when I sort of came to that realization, and then looking at what he actually did as chancellor, he was really, the first 6 or 7 years of Henry IV's reign were financially absolutely chaotic. And he, during his 3 years as chancellor, really brought the exchequer under control and restored solvency. So that was something I hadn't really fully grasped before this. And there were lots and lots of little surprises. When I came to really investigate his famous constitutions, these ordinances that he published in 1409, there was so much interesting stuff there. And I mean, it's clear that the constitutions have often been seen as kind of suppressing English literature, suppressing the inventiveness of English literature in the 15th century. But this is clearly not true. And I mean, what is interesting about them is how closely focused they are on Oxford. Arundel was determined to cut out this quasi-Wycliffite speculative thinking at Oxford. He didn't make himself popular. He made himself very unpopular with the Oxford academics. But he did, in effect, eliminate Wycliffism from Oxford.
Well, he was clearly politically extremely adept. I mean, the more the story goes on, he couldn't have gone on to do what he did after Henry became king.
He was a very robust character. I mean, I have a chapter in my book called Talking, Writing, Reading, which is all about, how Arundel talks, how he is presented as talking. And he's clearly a very, very, a very emotional orator, a great orator. And one of the things which surprised me, which I thought was very interesting, was if you look at the number of times that his spoken words are recorded in the chronicles, time.
Mm.
It is more even. It is more than much more than most people, almost anyone else, even more than the king.
Right.
He's a man. He's a man whose spoken words cut through to people.
It's the absence of so much personal communication of the kind that Carol has benefited from enormously, that prevents us getting a really strong immediate sense of him as an individual, which is one of the great advantages Carol has had. But Carol, do you get any sense from Chris's story of Arundel that it's a regret that he doesn't appear in the plays?
Yes, indeed. And in fact, what I was thinking that in fact, perhaps Shakespeare transports Arundel into Richard II by other means. So the speech that Bolingbroke has, slandering, taking apart Bushy and Green, sounds very much like the speech that Arundel speaks when he is savaging the king in no uncertain terms. And then the Kingmaker for Shakespeare, of course, he transposes that to Northumberland. And is going to carry that forward into parts 1 and 2 with the Percys and how they are. So I think Arundel is he's transported, he is inserted into the plays by other means.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, that wonderful line from Richard's speech in Parliament: "Northumberland, thou ladder wherewithal
Yes.
mounting Bolingbroke ascends the throne." I think that's such a great image.
Uh-huh.
I was thinking, I mean, this is a tangential point, really, but the portrait which you have on the cover of the book strikes me as an extraordinarily modern face.
Sorry, are you talking to me?
Yes, well, I am. Yes.
Yes.
I just wondered about that portrait because you credit where it comes from, but is it not known who painted it or when it was painted? Because
it's not known when it was painted, but I am very interested in this portrait, and I wish I'd made a bit more about it in the book because I've been discovering more about it.
it's a kind of it has a kind of realism which most paintings of the time don't have.
Well, I think it also has a naturalistic likeness, and I'll tell you why. Because there's an inscription on the portrait, which you may or may not have noticed. There's an inscription which tells you that this was done. This is a portrait of Thomas Arundel, Archbishop of Canterbury and Constable of Queenborough Castle. And it's got the date, the something of April 13th, I think, I can't remember, of April 1410 in it, 1410 in it. And it's actually, the portrait that we have now is a 19th century copy of the original. The original has been lost. But I am quite sure that portrait did exist in the 15th century, because if you look at Holbein's portrait,
I was going to say, yeah,
of William Warham, Archbishop of Canterbury, it is exactly the same composition.
Yeah.
So I am very, very excited by this portrait, because I think this is actually one of the earliest portraits in England which could be a naturalistic likeness to its subject.
It's intriguing for that reason. Yes, I mean, my first thought was I wouldn't mistake it for a Holbein, but it's closer to Holbein than it is to most. Yeah. And Holbein's 100 years further on, of course.
He is. Yeah. Well, he's a bit more. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Anyway, I might say more about the portrait at some point in some article. But anyway, I need to do more of that, I think.
Right. I think it's time to ask Carol to account for herself as well. Carol, tell us how it was that Henry Wotton first came to your attention.
Well, I am a Shakespearean, and all Shakespeareans know the name of Henry. Well, if they don't know the name of Henry Wotton, they know some of the writing of Henry Wotton, because he is the one who wrote in a letter to a nephew the story of the Globe Theatre burning down in 1613. During a play, performance of a play called All Is True, which was one of the first performances of a play called Henry VIII by William Shakespeare. So all of us Shakespeareans sort of know his name, know something about him, and probably many people will know the famous definition of the ambassador as the honest man sent to lie abroad for the sake of his country, which is Henry Wotton, though written in Latin.
And it's not a joke in Latin, of course.
And has a wonderful joke in English, but fails to have a joke in Latin, because in Latin, the verb to lie does not translate as a pun. Which eventually got him into a load of trouble. But in this double kind of way, I, as a Shakespearean, kept stumbling over the name Henry Wotton, the reality of Henry Wotton. And because I had started my academic life in archives, in looking at theatre records and trying to make a count of theatre records, I wanted a project that would send me back into archives. I am one who is infected with archive dust. I enjoy working with documents and papers and touching the real things, like Chris had in his hand, you know, the real papers that had touched the hand of Arundel. So I had the real papers that had touched the hand of Queen Elizabeth, Henry Tudor, Wotton, the Doges, and so
how
on.
How did you come to have your hands on those documents?
Because I naively went into the archive in Venice, the Archivio di Stato in Venice, and called up his papers. By the time I was looking at him seriously, he had been sent as ambassador from the court of King James, who was interested.
You knew he had the Venice connection.
Yes, he had the Venice connection, indeed.
But you knew that already.
Did I know that he had the Venice connection already?
Yeah.
No, I didn't. I did not know where to find him.
Okay.
So when I discovered that he was the ambassador, that he would be there, I wanted a project that would not only take me back into archives, but that would give me the excuse of doing a lot of deep research in Venice. So he was the perfect project, long-term project, to sort of take me through 10 years of the last decade of my academic career. So off I went into the archive, and the archivist pulled out the busta that has his original exposizione, the audiences with the Doge. And then I started working, transcribing what he had to say, and then how that communicated back to London, and what that meant for the court of King James, and the very Arundel-like person who was not only organizing regime change in England in 1604, but also doing that hard work that Arundel was doing of trying to systematize and make sense of the King's Exchequer. Robert Cecil, who was the Secretary of State to whom Wotton wrote all of his dispatches for the attention of the king. So that's what I was in, and I wanted to see how the business of an ambassador worked on a day-to-day basis. I wanted to know the mechanics, you know, because so often somebody will say in a biography, so he went to so-and-so, he went there, he did, and I said, but how did he get there? What did he look like? What did he eat? What was he looking at? And because Venice is in some respects, very much still the city that Wotton knew, I was able to find that life in Venice by being there and being in the archive and being amongst the papers, but also trying really genuinely to have how did he do it? What did he do? Where did he go? Who did he talk to? How was it all involved? And so on. So a life that was materialistically, almost anthropological, doing a kind of a deep dive into the first of his legations, the first 6 years of this time that he spent in Venice.
Because the role of ambassador and of embassy in the late 16th century was nothing like as closely systematized as it is now, and we tend to assume things about ambassadors and embassies, and of course none of that was written down or laid out for him. He was having to invent it.
Fortunately, when he went up to Oxford, and he's only 4 years younger than Shakespeare. He's only 3 years younger than the Earl of Essex, with whom he spent a great deal of time as secretary. But when he went up as a 16-year-old to Oxford, he encountered, just by great good fortune, the brothers Gentili. Alberico Gentili was Europe's foremost interpreter, understander of international law. And while Wotton was at Oxford, Gentili, in response to a big problem that England was having with the Spanish ambassador Mendoza, who was clearly in an attempt to assassinate the Queen, wanted to know what to do about an ambassador who plotted assassination, and he was called upon to judge this, to say, what is it? What can we do? We, as the Privy Council, and he had to say, you can't do anything, because an ambassador is protected by a barricade, an unbreachable barricade of immunity. But after the Mendoza affair, clearly he was thinking about this, and this is Alberico Gentili, and he wrote a 3-volume treatise on international law called De Legationibus, so legation. What is an ambassador? And it wasn't exactly a how-to manual about how to do embassy, but it was about all of the attributes of an ambassador and how he should behave, and what it was that how to define himself. So he gave, right at the time that Wotton was there and being tutored by Alberico Gentili in Italian and other subjects, gave him a way of conceptualizing the business of an ambassador, and some of, I think, the really important things that he should have carried with him to Venice, when by just the most extraordinary coincidences, now, I mean, he was never on the cards that he was going to be an ambassador, but by this extraordinary series of coincidences, named ambassador, that he would have had part of his muscle memory, things like, you are an ambassador is invested with the real presence of the king, but you are only a stand-in. You're a proxy. You are never speaking for yourself. You are only ever speaking on behalf of the king, which means that you must always wait for instructions from the king before you open your mouth. But given that he was being sent to Venice as a resident ambassador, eventually representing King James, and given that it takes 21 days for any message to get from Venice to London, and 21 days for any message to get back, that's 6 weeks, when an ambassador might have been asked a question that he cannot answer unless he does what I say as kind of the subtitle to my book. He starts inventing diplomacy, which is precisely what Wotton did.
Making it up as he went along.
Having to, yes, absolutely having to make it up as he goes along. Yeah.
So was
Carol, sorry.
Carry on.
Can I just very briefly come in there? I thought it was fascinating that when he most notoriously made it up, this question of whether England would support Venice when it was under interdict from the Pope, he actually probably benefited both sides by doing so.
That's my argument. That's my argument.
I thought that was fascinating.
I think it's also, I think it has come down in history that somehow it was the French behind the scenes who were very quietly negotiating the end to the interdict, reading, and this is where I think reading the documents, document by document by document, and reading what he was saying to London against what he was saying in Venice, and what Venice was saying back, and what Venice was saying in London, and so on, reading those things, page by page by page, one really does understand that that's not what happened at all, that the French were really playing fast and loose, and even when it came down to the final, supposedly the final transmission of the Pope's will, there was uproar because Venice said, we will not accept that. And that was on the day that they were supposed to finalize the end of the interdict. And there is Wotton in the middle of it saying, this is still free play. So I think that the risk that he took, and it was a major risk, although I don't think he really ever saw it as such. I don't think he saw it as taking a risk. He described himself as an ant bringing a little crumb to the table of negotiation. But in doing that, in taking that risk, he really did, I think, change the course of European history, because the war that was on the cards, that was constantly going to, and these jockeying between the Pope in Rome lining up, the Spanish behind him, poor old little Venice on its own, except that Wotton was assuring them that he would mobilize the king on the Republic's behalf. Without that, I think it would have been a very different end of the interdict.